Hello everyone, I'm Karan from CII and welcome to the CII SummitFX. We have with ourselves Mr. Dan Sato. He's the co-founder and publisher Animation World Network USA, and also we have with him is Mr. R.K. Chand. He's head of studio Technicolor Film and episodic VFX Mumbai Trace VFX. We are going to discuss on the big questions, the shifting sands and recipes. Over to you, Mr. Chand.
Hey, thank you, Karan. Thanks a lot, Team CII and the entire team behind SummitFX for getting this opportunity to have me connect with my dear friend and old colleague and journey over the last 2 decades in animation. How are you, Dan?
I'm fine. How are you?
So I'm supposed to introduce Dan Sato. So should I be introducing you as the omnipresent know-all of the animation world? Should I be introducing you as the publisher of the world's biggest AVGC news, or the co-chairman of SIGGRAPH Asia 2020, or as someone who has been a connoisseur and someone who has seen the major upheavals of the present times that we talk about and what he sees in the directions of the different verticals of the industry. I would also like to add for the audience that the Dan that I know of, and I'm sure he has been, is an expert chef and has an amazing fascination of Indian spices. And a little bird told me, Dan, that you it seems you make your own ghee and you toast and grind your own garam masala as well, and you add the typical Indian spices to your dishes. You still do that?
Wouldn't be Indian cooking without it. So yes, I do. My family thinks I'm a bit odd that way, but I couldn't do it any other way. So.
Thank you so much, Dan, for doing this, and I would love to hear from you more about the big questions in this completely surreal times. What are the shifting sands and recipes more towards the field of animation and visual imagery? All yours, Dan.
Sean, as always, it's even though we're not sitting next to each other in Annecy, it's good to see you, hear your voice, and thank you for the introduction. I want to thank Biren Ghosh and everyone at the conference for inviting me. Some of you may remember 3 years ago, I guess it was, just about 3 years ago at the B2B Summit. I was there in Bangalore and presented somewhat similar to what I'm going to run through today. So it's interesting to see what's changed, what hasn't changed, and how it has changed. So there's a lot to cover, and we'll only be able to cover a very small amount of it. And I'm guilty with regards to these types of presentations of trying to blast through a lot of material, fair number of slides, a lot of text on those slides. So I kind of apologize in advance for trying to cover quite a bit of material. Obviously, we're in some unprecedented and unknown times right now. While things are a bit different in different regions of the world, everyone has been affected adversely by the COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously, everything we talk about is framed within that overall context. And the last thing I want to kind of do before I jump into my slides is just remind you that I'm one person with one opinion, and I have rather strong opinions, but I feel entitled to my opinions because ultimately, while I can be relatively critical about certain things, it comes from a place of a passionate desire to see everyone succeed in our industry. Whether I like a show or not, whether I like a story or not, if it gets made, if it gets funded and made and distributed, it's a success as far as I'm concerned. So ultimately, and if you know AWN, you'll realize we very rarely review things, because that's not, and this goes back 25 years, that's not really what, I mean, we could and we do sometimes, but for the most part, we're talking about the people, the projects, the studios, the industry, and that's our focus, not whether or not we like something or whether something is good or not compared to something else. So with that as a little bit of a backdrop, I'm gonna share my screen now and pull up this large block of slides, and we'll start walking through some stuff, and hopefully what I have to say will be of interest.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, does that look okay on your end? Sorry for my phone. Okay, without further ado, obviously I'm the co-founder, publisher, and editor-in-chief at AWN. We've been in business for over 25 years, and we've been doing the same thing for all that time. We're chronicling the industry. So why am I here? Why was I invited to participate? And basically, I'm kind of a vendor neutral observer, because we cover everything, we talk about everything as much as we can, and our perspective is to let people decide what's important to them and try and make sense of it based upon how we present it. I'm often asked to kind of talk about topics that I say the 35,000 foot level, the overview level, and try and start from some type of broad contextual basis before digging down into some details. I try and help provide some perspective from an international standpoint. Obviously, I'm based in Los Angeles, and it's hard not to have a certain Western bias, but I travel extensively. I've spent a couple of years, over a few years, time in China with projects and media projects and such. So I have a relatively open view about what's going on in various places. And often I'm the person who kind of paints the harsher kind of, not ugly, but kind of the harsher picture of things, not to dissuade people, but to make them, to help them firm up their resolve that this is a tough industry and I'm going to need to be tough, but I love this so much that I'm ready. I'm ready for whatever challenges get thrown at me. And I'm also here because I probably watch more bad animation than all of you combined. And that's a highly subjective assessment, but trust me, I have. So what are the goals for this presentation? There's only so much we can cover. I'm going to cover a number of areas, kind of providing a basic snapshot of the international animation visual effects industry. As I mentioned, obviously within the broader framework of the pandemic, I'm going to focus a lot on features and kind of TV streaming business, because that's where much of it is at. I'm not really going to touch on things like short films and music videos, commercials, things like that. We're going to talk about some challenges, both in general, internationally, and challenges for Indian producers. And hopefully, after going through all of this, it will further excite your imagination by sharing some of my passion and love for all things animated, which really, if you knew what I do day in, day out, you'd know that if you don't have a passion for it, you'd burn out very quickly. So here's a 900-pound gorilla in the room. Obviously, everything is impacted by this pandemic. Some things more than others. Some things we're guessing how we'll come out of it. Some things we assume will be like they were when we come out of it. I think it's safe to say that some things will change and won't go back the way they were. We hope some things will. One of the biggest, some of the biggest kind of things coming out of this pandemic is that the theatrical business, as one of the leading economic drivers of our business, has taken a huge hit. And we have no idea how that's going to, what that's going to look like. In the United States, cinemas have opened in China. Cinemas, for the most part, are still closed in the United States and other places. When they come back, as they come back, there's going to be distancing rules and such. So who knows how quickly and to what degree the international box office will return. It's also meant that when we read about certain live action productions are starting up again, Avatar is starting up again, et cetera, what does that really mean? Well, it's very halting. The productions are starting up again. And for the most part, with safety measures in place for on-set for on-set shooting, there's going to be fundamentally, these live action shoots are going to change. Who knows if they'll ever go back to the way they were, let alone from an economic standpoint, the financial risks involved, getting insurance, things like that. The whole business is in tremendous flux. And while studios have pivoted quite quickly out of necessity to continue the productions they were on, both visual effects for live action and animation, the visual effects business has really taken a much bigger hit than animation, which will be a big part of what I talk about here, because the live action has shut down. So when the when kind of the pipeline for projects finished up, everybody's kind of waiting. There's been a lot of layoffs, more in the big studio and some of the visual effects folks. Some of it has been furloughs, some of it has been full layoffs. Everybody is scrambling. But on the animation front, as we'll talk more about here in the next few minutes, the animation business just feels like and seems like it's absolutely booming. And of course, the streaming business is driving all of that in the absence of the theatrical business, and it really was before the pandemic. A lot of what's fueling growth now is animation, and there's a need for the streamers are running out of content because the live action side of things has been shut down. Okay, I love to ask this question. So what? Who cares? Why is this relevant to us today? To producer, from the business people, the creatives, the developers, the financiers in animation. Why is this all relevant? Animation is a long, as we all know, animated projects require long-term commitments, especially on the economic front, because often they're monetized over years, decades sometimes. IP, as we know, IP can have value for decades. So we're trying to understand how to move forward and where the areas of opportunity are as we move forward from out of the kind of the wreckage of this pandemic. I contend that there's a new renaissance in digital communication and in animation. And animation in that sense is a really broad term, and it encompasses a lot of areas, many of which we're not going to necessarily cover. But animation as a whole fits the new digital medium like a glove. And there's an unprecedented amount of animation that is being greenlit, that had been greenlit before the pandemic, that has been greenlit during the pandemic, and that is coming to broadcasters and streamers and is going to continue with full force. There's also a tremendous amount of political upheaval and global economic change going on right now. And I normally don't talk about a lot of that because that's the last thing anybody wants to be reminded about, because that's the world we live in day out. But it impacts entertainment. Certain things impact entertainment more than others. And certainly you can look no further than the really rocky relationship that's going on between the US and China as a perfect example of it's changing every day. And when you're in an industry that requires risky multi-year investments in properties from the moment they start to the moment they're ready to be broadcast or distributed, that type of upheaval can be devastating. And I think it's also important to recognize that from an artistic and creative standpoint, more and more people are calling other people to take a stand, call to action in all sorts of areas. And while that's not the point of this discussion, it's relevant because it fuels our storytelling, and our storytelling fuels channels for entertainment. So that's why we're discussing this stuff. With regards to the Renaissance, what I kind of consider a new Renaissance in animation, the disruptive influence of streaming media cannot be overstated. You just can't. The proliferation of digital distribution of all types of communication, all types of media and entertainment within those platforms is it's unprecedented in human history, and it is fundamentally changing how people communicate in a visual medium. Throw in things like upcoming 5G networks and all the streamers, and this is obviously where everything is going to continue to head, probably for the rest of our lives. We live in a world where, for the most part, as content creators and distributors, you can communicate directly to everyone, whether it's through distribution platforms, entertainment middlemen, so to speak, or directly from creator to consumer. There is an unprecedented proliferation of creative tools now, from everything that you guys use, which you know better than I do, all of these different tools, but also with changes in real-time graphics rendering and the way that the cost of access to the top technology and expertise has really flattened, so that great work is being made everywhere, where it used to be in the hands of a smaller group, just because of barriers to entry with regards to the tools and the techniques and the expertise. And what that has meant is that while Hollywood is still Hollywood, and I live 10 minutes from Hollywood, and my office for many years looked out at the Hollywood sign, it doesn't feel like a very Hollywood-centric world anymore with regards to production. And great work is being produced and consumed and financed everywhere in the world. And not to beat the point into the ground, but auteurs are moving to the digital streaming platforms because it's creator driven, whether that's director or writer, and as we'll talk about later, it's free from many of the constraints, creative constraints, that the traditional production pipelines have been ruled by. And I think that to kind of tie that all up before we start on the next big section is that one of the things that is driving entertainment now with such diverse and globally enabled voices is that people are finding that by embracing our differences, there's a lot of great stories to tell, and there's a lot of interesting things to learn about and be entertained by. And it crosses every area of our culture. of everyone's culture. And I realize that everyone knows this, but I think it's worth repeating because as simple as it sounds, it's very powerful. Animation is an incredibly powerful medium of communication. We use animation to make us laugh, to cry, we get angry, we feel sad. It is a compelling, evocative, and powerful medium. It spans all borders. You can communicate without words, just visuals, in extremely effective and evocative manners. It spans all cultures and politics, and more important, and as important or even more important, it is everywhere, and it's used to convey every type of message and emotion. And the incredible relevance of this last point is that that means that wherever there is animation, someone needs to create it. Someone needs to create it, produce it, distribute it, and that's an opportunity for everyone. So real quickly, where are we finding animation still? This really hasn't changed. We're finding it in games, in all areas of games. We're finding it in what I kind of consider our traditional areas of animated entertainment, movies, TVs, all sorts of short form, from commercials and PSAs to short films, music videos, broadcast graphics, title sequences, all the short form stuff. Of course, then you start getting bigger. Theme park, I'm not going to really talk about theme parks, but obviously theme parks have been tremendously impacted by the pandemic and will probably continue to be adversely impacted for quite some time. When you look at visual effects, there's an unprecedented amount of new technology and effort in areas of virtual production, for example, and that's only going to increase as less and less can be filmed on site because you can't have that many people together to be safe. More and more things, more and more locations and situations and environments and assets are going to be produced digitally and integrated into productions through virtual production. Pitch viz, previs, tech viz, all the vizzes, as I like to say. There is more and more call for this because producers are getting more and more ruthless with where they spend their money and how much risk they want to take, especially because productions are going to take longer and be more expensive because of safety, because of how they'll need to be run to be safe. We've got all the 360 immersive stuff, including all the AR and VR. I'm going to touch on that a teeny bit, but again, not too much, because I don't know that there's new stuff being done, obviously, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of breakout like we're hoping to see that we haven't. World building transmedia, that's kind of an overreaching category that embraces a lot of things. And then of course, all these and other areas, all the viz, industrial type stuff, all the web, web specific animation, digital learning, there's animation everywhere. Who's buying it? Well, that really hasn't changed. How money is being spent, how much is being paid for certain things, budgets, in a certain sense, budgets for service work and for for production partners is going down because studios are so hungry for work. For a lot of the big animation studios, they have more work than they can handle. So the costs are going up there. And there's a lack of talent, so there's a dichotomy with regards to a lot of the economics of the industry. I know a lot of the VFX folks I talk to, they're starting to get bids a little bit, and the costs, the fee structures they're looking at, as I like to say, they're being asked to take an even bigger haircut than they had been taking before the pandemic. So all of these areas of who's buying animation it's still really the same. probably the biggest area of change is the theatrical and the kind of the special streaming type stuff. In the States, it's like Fathom Events, what do they call it? Pay-per-view type stuff that's done in a theater. Anything that's done in an actual location is problematic right now. So here's the guts of what I want to talk about. And this is kind of dense, so we're gonna run through this, okay? So bear with me. When we're talking about global animation industry trends, much is the same as it was before the pandemic. Some has changed, but what has changed mostly is just the unknown, trying to plan and finance work in the unknown, with the assumptions that we're going to get back to some sort of normal soon. Family films are still the safest investments because they travel all over. You look at films coming out of folks like Netflix, looking at a film that's coming up, Glenn Keane's Over the Moon, as a perfect example, a film that may have been made regionally, but it's designed for an international distribution. And it's a story, even though it's set in China, it could be set anywhere. There was a trend towards these, I call them mid-range, high-quality CG films. You look at a film like The Addams Family, and this is going to only continue because with the theatrical, with the theater business in flux, $150 to $200 million film is a big risk if you can't make $1 billion on it in the box office. So if you're looking at direct to streaming releases, limited theatrical release, films in the $30 to $60 million budget range, those are the type films also that would get made by a streamer. So there's production in those areas, but the high-end market with regards to the real returns on a film that you can make by having it be a blockbuster, that's really changed. That's probably the biggest change. And that was happening before the pandemic, and it's certainly coming out of the pandemic. As I mentioned, there's a lot of advances in real-time rendering and virtual production using game engines and other high-tech tools. There's a lot of cloud-based production right now, so the costs are coming down. Folks can use cloud-based, gen-up render farms and other types of high-end workstations with licenses, provisional licenses for software that they, as we say, pay at the pump. It's changing a lot of how people can gen up studios for projects. They don't have to spend millions of dollars on gear that might sit idle when they're waiting for the next project. Studios are releasing content directly to consumers. They're bypassing theatrical release. Look at a film like Trolls World Tour earlier this year by DreamWorks. That was done because they had to, but there may be more of that in the future, especially if we see people willing to pay. Mulan is coming out later this month on Disney Plus, but it's going to be a premium purchase, I believe, of $29.95. We'll see how that does. It's a subscription-based streamer that's going to have basically a special release of a feature that normally would just be a theatrical release. It's still hard and is going to be even harder with the theatrical business impacted to cobble together any type of international distribution, a market at a time for films. There's still quota systems and increasing content control in China. And I mentioned China just because outside the United States, that's the biggest box office destination. And who knows? That's a big who knows day to day. There has been limited success of Asian feature films coming to Western audiences. There's a lot of specialty stuff that's done, Certainly there are a few exceptions with some, for example, some of the Miyazaki films and some other Japanese anime, but it's still limited. It's limited in the scope of what it, you know, you're talking about small numbers of millions of dollars. For a small budgeted film of $5 to $10 million, that's okay. When you're talking about bigger studios, that's not a desired outcome for a film that costs $50 million. And as I mentioned before, auteurs are moving to, you know, they're auteurs that used to do shorts because that was they could make whatever film they want. They're moving to features and episodic because you can actually make money on those types of projects and you can get them funded. It's easier to get $7 million for a feature film than it is to get $500,000 for a short. What are some of the challenges that are going on right now? No matter what happens, it's the same every day. It'll be the same tomorrow. It'll be the same 10 years from tomorrow. And I don't care how much real-time animated tools there are, how much computer animation is innovated using AI to do a lot of the guts of it. Animated content is unbelievably, as I say, extremely, ridiculously, ginormously difficult and costly. I don't believe that's going to change. When you give people an opportunity to be more efficient, it gives them an opportunity to iterate more, not to iterate less. And consequently, artists will always take advantage of whatever they have to do more of what they do, not do less, because it improves the quality, which improves the marketability. Before the pandemic, more and more of the theatrical business, certainly in the United States, was being kind of monopolized by a small number of big studios that got the best release dates. And so getting into an impacted theatrical business is going to be even more difficult. When it comes to episodic, traditional broadcasters are providing a smaller and smaller portion of production funds in exchange for territory rights. So co-productions are increasingly harder to fund. That hasn't changed, and I don't think that's going to change. Hungry studios means VFX and series production fees are coming down because there's more people who want that business because they're coming out of the pandemic. But with all the animation being done, there's still a shortage for top talent, so the costs are going up. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but if you really dig into it, it does. More avenues for program distribution means more opportunities to make less money because the streamers, everyone is trying to figure out how to make money on subscription fees. At the same time, they're in this huge rush to stuff their program, their programming slates with content, and that content costs money. Whether they license stuff that's already produced or they take part in the productions from a budget standpoint. They're spending less, in aggregate more, and they're trying to produce more with it. There is a glut of animated content coming from everyone and his mom, including a lot of adult animated comedies for Western markets. There is an unprecedented amount of animation that's being, that's in process right now. Here's my one VR point. You look at stuff being done, a lot of it is really innovative and very cool. A lot of it is not that interesting to me. I know others would not agree, and some will throw stones at me for this. I still think we're obviously waiting to see, and we'll keep waiting to see. But it's not the barn burner that everyone had hoped it would be. And the last point I will make on this is that there's a sameness that has crept into the CG animation business, and so much stuff is just, it looks the same, and that's unfortunate. The competition is growing fiercer every day. I think everyone recognizes that. There's a lot of regional, across the world in different forms. There's a lot of tax credits and various government subsidies that actually kind of create an unbalanced playing field. It doesn't necessarily reflect, and some would argue it completely doesn't reflect, the true economics of the industry. And if the subsidies dried up, and we'll see how that might happen as government coffers start to dry up a bit, because the tax bases that, that fill them from everyone's businesses dry up as businesses have gone out of business. So we'll see. The promise of China is still just the promise. A lot of Western studios have just kind of, they've said, we've had so many bad experiences that we're just not pinning any hopes on what we had thought might be the new promised land. And I've lived that dream, and I've spent a considerable amount of time in China and worked day in, day out with folks there. And it's as tough a business there as it is anywhere else. And certainly for international, for folks coming outside the China market. Our industry is impacted by the fact that there's not, like there is certainly in the United States, Directors Guild, Producers Guild, various Writers Guilds, there's not a lot of guilds or unions, trade associations that represent animation or VFX artists. And so as far as having advocacy with regards to broader economic decision-making and lobbying, we're kind of way down there on the list. There has been, there was recently a big wage collusion settlement in the United States with regards to some of the biggest studios. And basically nobody cared. And it really showed that no one cares. People look at the entertainment industry and they say, you're all high paid anyways, so you'll be okay. And there's still a lot of schools and a lot of places that are pumping out students that honestly will never work in the industry. So what are some of the challenges for India? Everyone that I talk to kind of laments the fact that there's just not enough money in the domestic markets yet. Even though there's such a huge consumer base in China, in India, the reality is that domestic markets cannot provide enough revenue opportunities to support the type of production that you find a way to make, that you want to continue to make, and that you hope to be able to monetize internationally. The issue with regional storytelling, it's not just regional Indian storytelling, it's regional anywhere storytelling. It doesn't always play well outside the country. And it's difficult to tell the stories you want to tell for your domestic markets, and also try to have an idea, an eye towards how they're going to play elsewhere and how you're going to make money with them elsewhere. Financiers undervalue the time, effort, and expense that go into producing content of quality. There's always pressure to just, I like that over there, let's just do that. And it's hard to swim against that tide. There are still issues with production quality with regards to Western standards, although that's less and less an issue as the playing field for technology and expertise continues to flatten out, but it is still an issue. And there's still there's a lot of business people that have been in this business for quite some time, and they're just kind of through with Asia. And I say Asia, that's China and India and other places in Asia that for these Western business, it's not worth the hassle or the risk, especially since for many of them and the type of animation they produce, they actually can get some of that produced more in their own home territories than they had for quite some time. So what does the West want from Asia? Well, folks want Asian money. There's still this lure of access to ever expanding, underdeveloped consumer markets, still want access to less expensive production resources. They're always looking for new and creative business challenges. And then, did I say they're looking for money? They're looking for money. What does Asia want from the West? Almost identically, it's the same list for the most part. The only difference is that folks in Asia and folks focusing on India specifically, they profess a need, they want to access the international business acumen and creative and business and production expertise that the West has in abundance. And they want new creative business challenges, and they're looking for money as well. The last part of what I'm going to speak about today before we go to questions is really the crux of where I see opportunities across the board in the future. And that is, I say TV and streaming video on demand. It really is streaming video on demand. The broadcast and cable networks certainly are still very big, but that's changing as well. I go on record saying that the streaming business is the future for storytellers. And it has fundamentally changed the entire entertainment industry. I would say for the better. Because the world now is your audience, not just a local TV station or theaters in a region. More than just we can have a show that the whole world sees, we can make money and the streamers can make money on shows that just cater to a very small niche of people that like this type of story or that type of story. We like science fiction that's set, you know, we like shows that are about the medieval world. How many people, you couldn't release a film to the masses necessarily, but you could reach a group of those folks through a streamer. The streamers are providing production funds in some cases, and they're certainly licensing content that has already been produced. It does limit your upside potential because there's no profit participation potential unless you retain or part of the distribution side of a property outside of where it's being streamed. There's an increasing amount of competition. This year has been the year of the streaming explosion between Disney Plus and HBO Max and Peacock. And that's just kind of, they're certainly US centric, but they're everywhere, let alone Amazon and Netflix and all the other players everywhere else in the world. This was happening before the pandemic, and it's moving very quickly. Artists like the freedom and the budgets. The budgets for theatrical quality visual effects in many of the higher level shows, pretty substantial. It's hard work because it's 10 hours of visual, it's 3,000 shots over 10 hours of material, you know, of episodic content, for example, produced in 9 months, as opposed to 1,400 shots produced over a year and a half or 2 years. but the quality is fantastic, and that's only going to increase. There's also less studio interference and audience metrics in the in the streaming world. So folks work on a whole set of episodes and they're all dumped at once, mostly. Some are still, like CBS Access, All Access is putting stuff out 1 week at a time. But for the most part, everything is produced, and there's no metrics coming back from executives to say, hey, can you start messing with the last few episodes to change it based upon how the first few have been received. Regional storytelling has found new global audiences. There's a large number of shows right now, especially with really well done subtitling and dubbing. You're just as likely to enjoy a show that was made a Romanian crew or a Turkish crew or an Indian crew than it was from a group, from ILM. Studios that have focused on service work in the past are getting into the IP development and production business because they can, because the barriers to entry are not the same, are not like they used to be, and they have the expertise to produce because they've been doing all this work for all these years. And the streamers need a constant supply of new programming because they throw up a lot of stuff and some of it works and they got to keep throwing up stuff. So a few final thoughts. I'm based in LA, as I mentioned. The United States is going through an unbelievably crazy period right now, the culmination of the current administration's almost 4-year reign. And then you throw in a deadly pandemic. The world has looked to the United States historically, and this goes back to the beginning of cinema, has looked to the United States in so many ways with regards to entertainment production, from technology to financing to audiences. And we're in a state of, there's some interesting things going on. Push for diversity. Everything is unsettled right now. And when things are unsettled, it can be scary. Opportunities can be a little bit exhilarating, but for the most part, it's just a time of anxiety. As voices struggle to be heard, people are embracing and confronting intolerance in their homes, places of work, even in their own thoughts. What serves for storytelling now, what ideas and stories that people are focused on now have undergone some significant changes. And that's yet to be seen where the opportunities will come from because of those changes. And a gathering like this summit, even though it's done digitally, and we all miss getting together in a place to share a coffee or just to shake hands or have a hug with someone like John, who I haven't seen in a number of years, it's a really critical opportunity to reflect and focus and discuss issues and ideas surrounding this shared passion we all have for this incredible medium of animation that impacts our own lives, it impacts the work that we've chosen to do, and it impacts the entire planet. And I will always contend that through accepting, embracing, and celebrating our differences, we can ensure a better world for ourselves and our children, but it will also spur some of the best storytelling that is yet to come, and storytelling that I can't wait to see. And so what did we learn today? As I always like to say, when it comes to animation, everything is awesome, because animation is just the place that I want to be and the place I spend my days and nights. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much. And thanks again for having me. And let's open up for some questions.
Dan, that was like an encyclopedia of information for all of us, Dan. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I know, as I said, I know I blew
all the
through
information. I No, but you know, the amount of insight that has gone there, and there is amount of foresight, as you said, you know, what's coming in the future was really nice. I did have a couple of questions from my side, and we did receive a few, but I would say most of them were covered
Breaking up a little
in
bit.
part of your example. Which part of the industry? Yeah, like which part of the industry you see maximum impacted? I think that you definitely covered it on the VFX side of it. Uh, will you see an animation genre see a boom in the family and the adult genre? You did mention that about, you know, like there are so many requests coming up for new kind of shows about family entertainment, which does use animation. Uh, Good to hear about you believing in the renaissance in the digital communication. I think there are three questions, especially, which we should just address. And
Okay.
one is, do you see the center of excellence in animation and VFX shifting from North America and United States and being more spread out, especially with the way that people are doing cloud-based studio working and artists working from home?
Okay. I answer that in two ways. This is how I look at it. Finance, three ways: finance, production, and viewership. So the center of the center of the business is going to be where most of the money that writes those checks, that starts the production process, where that's coming from. Much of that still comes from Hollywood when it comes to theatrical and, you know, the TV episodic type stuff. Certainly there are other hubs, but for the most part, the United States still is the main market where we don't need to do international co-productions to get stuff made, because there's enough money in our domestic markets to pay for it. So that's why it's not as dispersed as it is when you look at the EU, for example. There's money coming out of film funds and government funds in every country in the EU, as well as in every area of Asia for the most part. And so a lot of that stuff is still driven by governments, whereas and that goes into the historical nature of media production and control of media as a government tool, going back to, you know, when radio, going back to when radio started, let alone visual media. So the government has always had a hand in what gets made and what gets played. In the United States, the government doesn't determine what gets made and what gets played for the most part. There are certainly some censorship issues, but not when it comes to, but that's only for government airwaves and the digital world. So that I don't think is changing that much, where the money is coming from. From the production side, with especially, it was leading that way, it was going that way leading into the pandemic, but certainly coming out of the pandemic, the cloud-based remote production is certainly here to stay. I think as soon as people can, there's a lot of production that it really, really helps when you're looking over each other's shoulder. So I think that will come back to a certain degree, but I think there will be more distributed, remote, cloud-based production that goes on, even if it's smaller satellite studios. I think that is here to stay. And then certainly as far as distribution, where people are viewing it, people are viewing animation literally everywhere. And as soon as 5G starts to hit, they literally will be viewing the fattest content everywhere, because it'll be easy to get. So that's kind of how I see this all broken out.
Yeah, and one question connected to, what's your opinion in work from home? Do you think it will foster more creativity? Because many times the artists would just say that they don't want to do a 9-to-5 job, even if it's inside a studio. Do you think it will foster more creativity and reduce costs, especially for independent independent studios or development studios?
You know, I think some of how that will play out is going to be based upon how the studios view and treat their artists. And that's not a new thing. And some folks would say, no studio treats their artists well. And some would say, there are some that are treated very well. Depends who you talk to. But what I mean by that is the studios will use whatever pipeline makes the most sense based upon what they're trying to produce and make money from.
Agree.
Certainly in the United States, with the push towards this, which many, including myself, feel is kind of a deleterious expansion and disruptive reality of the quote-unquote gig economy, from folks that are delivering packages for Amazon to folks that are driving for Uber. That's only been exacerbated by the pandemic because everybody is staying at home and everybody needs everything brought to them. So I think that there's the potential to take a situation where you can cut some costs by not having everybody have to drive in to work in one big bullpen. But that doesn't necessarily mean those costs are going to enable greater creativity from the part of the artists who actually can work remotely when they wouldn't be able to go to that studio. I think I think a lot of studios will just use that ability to save money by just doing the same old work they do and just spending less for it. Maybe they will make a bit more money for it. But I think the flip side of the coin is that we're seeing a lot more really interesting creative work that was done by folks that were locked down during the pandemic because they need to create. It's like, what am I going to do? I'm a creator. I've got to create. And so they do have access to much of what they had before, including setting up home motion capture studios. Yeah. And thankfully they all have good internet. So I think that will only increase. And for certain gatekeepers, and I think new gatekeepers will come up with their own channels within streaming platforms, they will champion the work of more independent people because the quality will be there. Yep. So that's my answer. That's my long answer to that question.
Yeah, I like that guy, right? Who did the VFX in camera, and the Disney had in fact saw that video on Twitter, right? And kind of tweeted on there. And I think the digital economy and the way that access to independent creativity has fostered in this time, in this last 5 months, might really ignite some new ways for content to be created. Maybe the formats might change, right? The formats might become into a short format consumption driven with the TikToks and the Instagram Reels and other formats coming in as a new format for telling stories as compared to just the OTT platforms and the streamers. That was my question. I think that is one part that I thought would like to pick here.
I completely agree with you. And I didn't focus on the artist-driven side of this too much because my focus was more on the kind of the business producer side of things from this type of a conference. But I had my last year at SIGGRAPH Asia in Brisbane and the previous summer, last summer, both at a couple events back to back in Korea. I really had my eyes opened to new areas, big areas of animated content production that was being monetized in these regions. Motion comics, digital characters, digital avatars, concerts with all digital real-time characters, esports. There's a lot of areas that you don't necessarily hear. They come out of the fact that in these areas, artists have not had the financial base to produce content on par with what's being produced elsewhere. So, but they need to create. And so they've created a lot of new opportunities for new types of content. And when you look at real-time engine, real-time graphics, engines and rendering, and a lot of this new technology, what had been kind of these parallel areas of content development, they're intersecting more and more. And I think you're going to see more and more people being able to kind of cobble together some sort of a living by creating, their own projects that fit into these areas that are not the traditional theatrical or SVOD pipeline.
Yeah.
So I agree with you completely.
Definitely. I think we have really run out of time now. Dan, we have time for one last question, maybe. And
anybody, I mean, I'll stay as long as you keep keep the broadcast on if there are any questions.
Yeah, so there is one question that I think had come actually from a friend, and he didn't ping there. 1 second, and he had messaged me in between when that slide had come up. Do you feel investments and commitments of development studios into the IPs will reduce, or do you think it will increase? Because these are all long term, right? They all take 5 years, 10 years to come to the stage of kind of fruition. And you have seen it more in California than anywhere else. Do you think in the current scenario of the economic scenario that the industry is in, do you feel the investment and commitments of businesses into development work and to development studios, which are not full-fledged production studios, into IPs, do you think it will reduce, or do you think it will grow?
That's a good question. And I think and see it growing, but it's not something that you can just click a link on to see who's doing that. A lot of it is done in the back rooms. A lot of it is done through folks, their own networks. What fuels it all is just the fact that, for a lot, we're not talking about the traditional IP investments from the traditional stakeholders that are always looking, they're licensing books and they're licensing existing content to then bring to, the visual world.
Yeah.
A lot of investment is really done. It's more vanity investment. Folks get ideas, folks see things being made, they see the proliferation of animated content, and it's like, well, we have a good property, we have a good idea, we could do that, we've got the money, I've got I know some folks with money, they invest in all sorts of things. So there's that, but there's also everyone who's got skin in the game, as we say, in entertainment, is looking for the next big property, because that still fuels the kind of dollar signs in people's eyes, which is why they're always going to markets, they're always scouring the news, they're always looking on, on social media, they're checking to see who posted some interesting little thing. That's their business. They're chasing potential IP everywhere. When they see things, there's money. They will put money towards development. They'll put money towards licensing ideas. They'll option things. That has not and will not change. If anything, that's going to increase because of all the streaming the opportunities in all of these streaming platforms that are new. Those are new opportunities the last handful of years. So I see that increasing, not decreasing. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to find or any easier to get. And it doesn't mean the job of IP producers is any easier in pitching and articulating and coming up with ideas. But it's out there.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Dan, for your answers, for the insightful session. I'm sure the presentation is going to be very useful when people see it, even more in the format that will be shown as the recorded versions maybe later, once we kind of have a word, spread the word around about the sessions. But thank you so much. It's a wonderful experience and always a pleasure speaking to you. And I hope times will be there soon when we meet again by the lakes of Annecy and
I
enjoying the charm of a conference in person.
I can't wait to get back on the road, and I
Same here.
thank you again for everyone for inviting me, and hopefully something, you know, there's something that I just shared resonated with you folks, and hopefully it will be of some benefit. I enjoyed my time, and thank you very much again.
Same here. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Team
Okay.
CII, for this. Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe, Dan.